This week, for my National Park Service visit, I'm highlighting the Pierce Mill in Rock Creek Park, an easy-to-reach location just at the southern tip of Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C. The mill was built in 1829 to serve the milling needs of local farmers and merchants who had brought in wheat, rye, and especially corn to be ground for flour, grits, and animal feed. The mill was in operation from 1829 until 1897 when the main shaft broke. At that point, the water-powered mill, already located in the newly formed Rock Creek Park, was being surpassed by steam and then coal-powered mills. Fixing it was deemed a poor investment. While we might think of wheat as the main mill grist, the records from this mill regarding the relative amounts ground in 1870 are a good representation of grain use in America during the 19th century. It ground 40 bushels of wheat flour, 150 barrels of rye flour, and just over 4,000 bushels of corn. And that was divided between animal feed and meal and flour ground for human use. The fact that corn products far outstrip the other ground grains is typical of the country, even if we think of ourselves as a wheat country. In 2011, the mill was refurbished and once again grinds corn. So if you want to see the grinding of America's most important grain in one of the old ways, take a trip out to the Pierce Mill at Rock Creek Park in the nation's capital. Episode 120, Corn, the National Vegetable. Hello and welcome to the history of American food. This week I'll be looking at corn as it enters the industrial age. It gets an image makeover, a new style of milling, and goes kind of underground. Who eats it and how is in for a big change. Oh, and it plays a supporting role in the impoverishment of Ireland and has a hand in the bubble that preceded America's first major economic depression. If you want to see how that all works out, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the research for this episode convinced me I might have to change my tile to include an ear of corn. But we'll see about that. The other first thing you need to know is that several years ago, the term cracker, as a personal descriptor and implied insult, was explained as referring to the type of person who is a whip cracker on a plantation in the antebellum South of the United States. Now, this didn't feel right to me since I had grown up knowing it as an insult thrown at a white person who was acting classless and crude, often from one white person to another. As in, I don't need to hear from that cracker. I mean, yes, it was preferentially applied to people from Georgia and Florida, and Georgia has had the nickname the Cracker State, so kind of true, but it really seemed off to me. Well, I am here to tell you that the definition is completely wrong from a historical perspective, and the reason it comes up now is that the word and its meaning became popular right in this period of the early 19th century. Up until the 19th century, corn was always ground dry. All stored whole grains have a very long shelf life as long as they are dried properly and kept dry. Seeds sprouting from Egyptian tombs and pack mules casually munching on 1,000-year-old corn specimens dug up in archaeological digs at Mayan sites make this point. The starchy endosperm and the protein and fat-rich germ or seed are kept separate until water activates them or until they are broken open by mill or beak or tooth. But once crunching happens, a chemical cascade begins. Unlike wheat flour, which is often bolted or sifted to separate the germ from the flour to keep it from going rancid, in this period, and at all times before, corn kept its germ, which meant that the oils from the corn germ remained in the ground corn. And when the oils were exposed to oxygen, it would go rancid if not used up in a timely manner. This also meant a fair number of people were eating musty or sour cornmeal. If you were pretty well off, you could avoid rancid cornmeal and corn flour in a number of different ways. But if you were particularly poor or lived a ways away from a mill, you'd have to crack your own corn on basically a daily basis using exactly the same samp mills of the American native locals and the 17th century early colonists. That is, a hollowed-out tree stump mortar with a wood pestle springing and swinging from an overhanging tree branch. And I talked about these all the way back in episode 7. But down in the state of Georgia and Spanish Florida, these samp mills were known as hominy blocks, and the person who had to daily crack their own corn instead of having it milled for them was known, derogatorily, as a cracker. As time went on and more milling became available, including metal hand-cranked home mills, cracker would more specifically apply to people who were not able to purchase milled meal or sometimes chose not to because they were using the cracked corn for the production of untaxed alcoholic beverages made on the sly. Moonshine. Now sure, some of it from northern and western Georgia in the Piedmont might be pretty good stuff, comparable to the whiskeys made from the fast-flowing creek water of Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky's limestone hills. But the stuff made from sluggish coastal river water with mash cooked over resiny pine wood, well, I'm sure that was legendary in a different way. But the early 19th century corn was the fuel that was turning the labor crank of America, both animal and human. It was a very limited export crop, but it was the majority grain grown and processed in America. In fact, it was the majority crop that was being grown. And yet, as a food, it was largely denigrated, or at least given a lesser place on the 19th century table. In the same way deer and venison gave way to beef at the end of the 18th century, corn was utterly giving over to wheat in the 19th century as the food people wanted to see on their table. In an odd way, corn stopped being appreciated as a food even as it was literally feeding the nation, both in bowls of mush and in profits. Instead, people saw it as the food that made food, and if it did show up on tables, white corn was considered people food and yellow corn was animal food, or the food of the poor cracker, or the enslaved. While it's true that different corn is good for different things, there's flour corn with a particular makeup that makes it ideal for that, and there's the large kernel corn used for whole hominy and hominy grits, the round, hard-skinned popcorn, along with numerous others that were lost out of the profit and speed-focused American agriculture scene. For the consumer, color, rather than fitness for a job, became the determining attribute. And as an aside, one of the biggest losses from the American corn scene was the blue corn that was particularly good for making the masa that went into tortillas. Notably a flatbread of no interest to the wheat-focused European-descended Americans. As we enter the 19th century, consumers began to have choices about what they ate. They started to have purchasing power and the possibility of purchased food products instead of just eating what they grew, found, or made. And there was a prevailing opinion that white meal and grits and hominy were people food and yellow was not. Or at least it was inferior for some reason. Now the one exception to corn, was green corn or incompletely ripened corn. Now as urbanized Americans with refrigerators at the end of a long cold chain to catch produce and keep it fresh, we've lost the plot a little as to what fully ripe and mature corn is. That's where the stalk is yellowed and the corn ears have bent down. The kernels have dried to the point where it's only breakable by horse teeth, metal teeth, or stone. The corn we see when we buy corn at the grocery store to eat at the table is immature, incompletely ripened corn or green corn. The sugary milk inside the kernels has not yet completed its conversion to starch. That's the food that allows it to be stored until it is ground or planted in a moist hillock of earth. Modern sweet corn is now usually a variety with a genetic mutation that disables or markedly slows the chemical processes that would start the sugar to starch cascade. But back here in the 19th century, all corn, when in this immature state, was sugary and milky. So if picked and boiled or roasted right away, it was a divine, if short-lived, seasonal treat. So green corn meant too young to pick for storing, but just right for a few tasty meals in season. And because it was a fleeting treat, it never lost favor on the table. But even as ground corn was losing favor as American table food, it was finding markets abroad in Europe as the Napoleonic Wars continued to ravage the European continent. Remember Waterloo, the last big battle? It took place in 1815. In the years leading up to that, the U.S. exported a fair amount of wheat, to be sure, to supplement the fields trampled by armies as the Napoleonic hordes gobbled up chunks of other countries whole. But the U.S. also exported plenty of salt meat, salt fish, and corn to fill in holes left by all the fields untilled and animals unfed and unraised by the absences of all the people dragged away from their farms to serve in armies, or killed during the 11 years of the Napoleonic Wars. This is also the period when the Anglo-Irish began to rapidly expand their influence over the native Irish farmers, changing their relationship to the land they tilled, the cows they raised, and the crops they grew. The Napoleonic Wars meant England was putting the screws to the Irish tenant farmer and importing more food, wheat and beef especially, from Ireland, which meant the Irish themselves were left eating the potato and imported American maize. This meant, sure, wheat was the money grain, but now there were markets abroad for corn too. It was easier to grow and produce many more bushels of grain per acre than wheat or rye or barley or oats. With these new export markets, now it wouldn't just feed the poor farmer or the livestock or the still, it could be sold for hard coin as well. Because corn was so bountiful and now somewhat profitable, in average conditions, enough could be grown by a medium-sized family to last the winter, plus enough for a few money ventures. It became a major tool in the arsenal of the westward movers in the first half of the 19th century. Following on the heels of the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery's trip into the Louisiana Purchase and the final kicking out of the British from the Great Lakes region following the War of 1812, the cash-strapped United States started selling off parcels of land to private citizens to build up the depleted treasury. The cash spike created by the Napoleonic War exports were just the start. The completion of the Erie Canal in 1825 proved that there was ever more money to be made from pushing out west, plowing large fields in the flat lands far from population centers near the coast, and then shipping the produce back. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, following on in 1830, only reinforced this view. Financiers, domestically and in Europe, began to feel that for investment purposes, America was a no-lose proposition. More canals were planned. The Erie Canal was set to be expanded, and millions of dollars were poured into railroads crisscrossing the old New England colonies and then further out west. The Mitten of Michigan planned not just a canal across the wrist, but up to 3 railroads as well to cut down on the time of sailing all the way around the whole mitten, or pulling carts across questionable roads at ox pace. In fact, the idea that one could travel out to a new plot of land, cut seams in the prairie sod, and raise a crop of corn to make it to the next year felt so true that the U.S. government was able to sell 50,000 square miles of territory in just 24 months during 1835 and 1836 to a combination of hopeful farmers and, as always, speculators who then resold the often questionably obtained land for tidy profits. See, Ticketmaster didn't come up with anything original. At approximately 160-acre lots at a time, or 4 plots per square mile, approximately 100,000 new farms were formed in just 2 years. That meant the almost instantaneous formation of towns on unplowed, barely charted land that had been serving as hunting and foraging landscapes for tribes and wildlife for centuries to millennia. But in just 2 years, there were now somewhere around 50 to 100 new towns just spontaneously formed, and it really fired the anything is possible idea for many Americans, new and otherwise. While the 72,000 square miles were only a drop in the bucket of the 160 million square miles that would ultimately go under the hammer during the Homestead Acts after the Civil War, this was a fundamental change to the shape and size of farming country. As you might imagine, the assertion that something, here an investment in American growth, is a sure bet and can never go down, it's going to cause problems. and it did rather quickly. The rapid expansion of new farms, new canals, new railroads based on earlier prosperity with no market examination caused people to invest far more than they should have and many could have, and caused states and towns to take on far more debt than they should have. Corn and cotton futures, along with bonds on canals and railroads, collapsed, causing all manner of investors to lose their shirts, their farms, and in a few cases, large fortunes. States defaulted on loans, and some, Florida and Mississippi, repudiated them entirely. This irrational exuberance about the limitless expansion of America was at the root of America's first Great Depression, and it lasted from 1837 into the mid-1840s. And the rapid expansion of corn-based farms in American hinterlands, and the bets people were making on them at home and abroad, were all part of it as well. Up through the early 1800s, the conventional wisdom was that if trees wouldn't grow on a patch of land, then surely corn never would. And this was true in the Northeast, where the earliest farming ventures had been tried. So as farmers spread out into Virginia, the Carolinas, and the new Kentucky, the practice was to clear out trees, haul stumps, build log cabins, and farm in man-made, family-made clearings in the woods. The women and children were a big part of the clearing labor. But as people traveled out of the granite-strewn Northeast and hauled carts through the Cumberland Gap, the prairies that resembled thick-grown wheat fields in their plant density made some people question this trees-to-corn wisdom. Plenty of people skipped right over what many called the grassed American desert to set up in the disputed Oregon Territory or to try their luck in Spanish California. But some others, hungry to own land, any land, were willing to try their luck in the sea of prairie sod. So by the time Jethro Wood introduced the idea of interchangeable parts to manufactured plows in 1817, followed by the John Deere Moline plow, specifically engineered to cut through prairie sod in 1837, there was a market for such devices. The idea of breaking untreed land to grow crops was odd in the new expanding America, but there were plenty of people ready to invest sweat, money, and time in the venture, especially if the venture came with land that had river frontage where crops could be shipped to New Orleans for hard cash. Later on, when I get to railroads, I'll introduce you to the NFTs of the 19th century, and they have their roots in this and the following waves of overland expansion. But for now, it's important to note that people were traveling out to their new land in winter so they could be ready to plant the first corn crop and get their corn and cabin rights settled. For along with the apple orchard, a corn crop was a way to show that land had been claimed and, most importantly, improved, and thus ownership rights established. With the expansion of farms and corn crops and farmers and markets, the way corn was used also expanded. The earliest colonists in North America had attempted to use the sweet juice found in green corn stalks to make beer, while trying to figure out how to grow barley and wheat. That had been a bad idea. But here in the 19th century, immigrants from Prussia and the emerging German states were bringing the technology of ensilage, or better known as silage, to America. This turned out to be a good idea, even a great one. It's still in use today. Mentions of the practice of fermenting green summer fodder in airless spaces have been found in Roman manuscripts. The practice has appeared here and there wherever a farming society collects fodder. Basically, the method is taking still green fodder from the spring and summer, burying it in rock-lined trenches and letting it slightly ferment until the process is stopped by a lack of oxygen. Then over the winter, this sort of sauerkraut of feed could be given to livestock. I mentioned sauerkraut especially since the practice was widely practiced in Prussia and other Central European states with shorter growing seasons and longer winters. While different hays and legumes were used in Europe, green and partly dried corn stalks turned out to be excellent silage on American farms. And by the by, any time You drive by hay fields, and there are those big rolls of hay wrapped in plastic. That is modern silage manufacture. Now, fully dried corn stalks and leaves found their way into all sorts of second lives on farms. The stalks stacked around cabins worked as insulation, becoming ever more effective as they were covered with snow and kept the wind out. Scarecrows were built of last year's stalks and stuffed with last year's shucked corn husks. The leaves or blades could be cut and fed to stock, either as cured leaves or as part of the silage. The corn husks pulled off the dried corn served as wrappers for any manner of things, including sausages, and the thinnest, innermost layer of the husk could be used as wrappers for that newfangled vice, rolled up shredded tobacco, cigarettes. The cobs, once the corn had been scraped or twisted off, had 1,001 uses, from fire starter, back scratcher, for humans, pigs, and cows, lantern wick, fur comb to treat skins brought in by trappers, corks for fishing lines, corks for jugs, and of course, for the purists who weren't into this newfangled cigarette thing, they could become corn cob pipes. As corn crops were grown everywhere, the Native American technology of the corn crib was adapted to European building fashions. So these cribs, built up on stilts with wide roofs and gaped slats and away from other structures, were built to finish drying and to store the hard corn for later use. Husking corn, or taking off the cover prior to storing, quickly became a popular community event. The husking bee was a natural pair with the apple peeling bees that were essential for the putting up of dried apples. Shucking races and work songs were often greased by the presence of a jug or so of last year's corn squeezins, made into corn liquor. Wheat was the cash crop for some farms, but for many others, the corn was fed to the moneymakers, hogs and cattle. Before the railroad, in those war days, 1812 here and in Napoleonic ravaged Europe across the Atlantic, transporting wheat as a grain overland from places like inland Lancaster, Pennsylvania, was profitable. But cheaper corn from Cumberland in the Allegheny Range was not. However, corn-fed hogs and barrels of early butter from silage-fed cows was. Corn truly was the food that made food. And corn was also the food that was fed to labor to make money. After all, this is the period when cotton was king, and corn was the other half of the purchased food that was grudgingly given to the people who poured wealth into the purses of the very few who got very rich off the cotton boom. Pork was the first half, and it was mostly grown on the plantations where it was eaten because pigs serve a lot of useful functions even when they're alive. But corn was often purchased in. Once the cotton gin was adapted to American short staple cotton by Eli Whitney, there was no time to grow corn. Unless you think the corn was being grown elsewhere up north or something and shipped into the South, this was not so. Only a fraction of the land was actually dedicated to cotton. Far more was used to grow corn to feed the labor that grew, picked, and processed cotton so it could be sent to mills in England. By the 1850s, cotton, tobacco, wheat, and rice combined were only 2/3 of the value of corn grown in the U.S. And this is when 60% of the American cotton crop was being shipped to England, mostly to Manchester, to feed their thread and weaving mills. So corn was the food to grow other food and to feed labor. But there was even more corn in this period. And part of the recovery out of that 1837 crash was finding new ways to make more money out of that corn. The first big breakthrough was wet milling. As I said at the top of the episode, corn and the rest of the other grains up until now had been dry milled. There was just the grain and the grinder, nothing else. Wet grains would just smoosh, not crack so they could be ground to grits or powder for flour. But what if you wanted the grains to smoosh? What then? Well, let's talk about starch. Starch is a byproduct of grains that's been around basically since people have been milling grains. Think ancient Egypt. Wheat starch can be found on old papyrus scrolls as a fixative. And honestly, how do you think they got those pleats in those old Egyptian linen garments? Starch had wide-ranging wardrobe and cosmetic functions in Europe by the time American colonization was happening, starching those Elizabethan ruffs, as hair powder, as face powder, and so on. But strangely, not for cooking, at least not much and not yet. When starch was wanted, wheat starch was most commonly used. Initially, the grains were boiled, and then the water was strained, and then concentrated and dried. Then it was discovered that wheat left to ferment, then squeezed, yielded more starch. But the leftovers from that process were a stinky, unusable mess. But no matter. The wheat starch leftovers were just tossed in the local waterway, blending with the other odoriferous sewage. And once America had a wheat crop, the same method was used there. Until, potatoes. And making potato starch was much easier and started to eat into the purchased starch market because it was pretty easy to make potato starch at home. But then, with the wider availability of isolated chemicals at the end of the 18th century, an alkaline process for loosening starch from wheat was developed in England in 1840. Even better, the leftovers from that process could be reacidified and added back into livestock feed rather than tossed into the sewer. Yet another industrial waste product turned into a profitable item. Now, Orlando Jones's alkaline British process was patented in America in 1841, but wheat was too valuable as a grain to be disassembled for starch. But on the other hand, there was corn. There was plenty of corn. And in 1844, the first cornstarch factory using the new alkaline process was opened as part of the early Colgate Company. And it was with these alkalinized cornstarch factories that the true wider life of corn began. With a cheap abundance of cornstarch, food uses in the U.S. started to be developed. And with the germ now isolated, it started to be processed into oil-rich animal feed. The wet milling revolution was started, and corn started to disappear further into the food system. Not only was it now the food that was fed to other food, it would start to be added to food to make it other than it was. I mean, not so much now in the early 19th century, but the door had been opened. And that wasn't all. With the start of transporting corn-fed animals and their products to city centers on foot, by water, and then by train, the arrangement of the country's food system was also about to be overturned. Coming up soon are the cattle drive, the Chicago stockyards, and the whole meat processing megaplex attached to the growing American railroad. But before we can get into the interaction of ice, the railroad, and the explosion of refrigerated food of questionable provenance arriving in American urban markets, it is time to look at one of the oldest preservation methods, salt, and how it became an industry with other chemicals in early 19th century America. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. I enjoy reading them, and they let people know that you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least finding it interesting. Keep your eye out. I am going to be experimenting with some recipe videos now that there are cookbooks, and the first one will deal with, you guessed it, corn. I'm still doing my deep dive into the 19th century with my co-host Jamie Lewis from Plague of Strength in our much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. As always, there's still food, but there's also fashion, fighting, and fraud, and a few other F's, which makes it fun, but not necessarily E for everyone. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta and other places around the internets as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.